We've all been there, right? You're scrolling and suddenly, boom, a scary health headline that just sends your mind racing. Well, in this explainer, we're going to give you the tools to cut right through that fear and start thinking like a scientist. And we'll do it by looking at the original data.
So let's kick things off with a real bombshell. This statement came out hinting at a massive, massive breakthrough, a supposed answer to autism. And it was linked to one of the most common painkillers on the planet. I mean, you can imagine a claim that big, it got everyone's attention, and fast.
And this is where it gets really interesting. You see this huge gap between the headline and what was actually said in the science. The news was screaming about a link, but if you look at the original research, the scientists used a much more careful word, association. And trust me, that one little word changes everything. Now, this wasn't just some, academic debate. This stuff has immediate, real-world consequences. The company that makes Tylenol, their stock dropped 10% almost overnight. It just goes to show you how a simplified, scary headline can ripple out and affect everything from the stock market to, of course, the anxiety of expecting parents. So how do we get better at spotting this stuff? Well, it all starts with understanding the absolute golden rule of science. Honestly, this one simple concept is the single most important tool you have for making sense of health news without totally panicking. Okay, let's break it down. Correlation is just when two things happen in a similar pattern. You know the classic example, right? Ice cream sales and shark attacks both go up in the summer. They're correlated. But eating ice cream doesn't cause shark attacks. The heat does. That's the third factor. Causation, on the other hand, that is a whole different ballgame. It's way harder to prove because it means you've shown that one thing directly makes the other thing happen. And if we dive back into that Tylenol study, the picture gets, well, really messy. See, it was what's called a meta-study, which means they didn't do any new research. They just reviewed a bunch of old studies. And the results were all over the map. Sure, 27 studies found some kind of link, but 9 found nothing at all. And get this, 4 of them actually found that taking it reduced the risk. That is a long way from the slam dunk evidence the headlines were selling. In fact, the lead researcher himself practically had to jump in and hit the brakes. He was very clear, saying, look, we found an association, not a cause. He even suggested that maybe the real issue was whatever fever or infection the mother was treating in the first place, not the medicine itself. But that critical detail, completely lost in the media storm. And it wasn't just him. The broader scientific community pushed back, and they pushed back hard. Other analyses found major flaws in the studies that claimed a link. A gigantic Swedish study of 2.5 million kids pointed to family genetics. And maybe most important of all, gynecologists came out and said, hey, not treating a high fever during pregnancy can be far more dangerous than any theoretical risk from the medication.
So, if that's what shaky evidence looks like, what does good science look like? To really get the difference between a flimsy link and a solid finding, we need to go inside a real study and see how the detective work actually gets done.
Let's look at a perfect example of this in action, a study out of Spain. Researchers wanted to answer a pretty specific question. Does air pollution from traffic affect a baby's birth weight? And the key difference here is they weren't just digging through old papers. Nope. They were actively following a group of people forward in time to get fresh, detailed data. And as you can see, they followed a super rigorous process. They got a group of 570 women, collected incredibly detailed info, and even modeled the precise pollution levels at each person's home. Then they crunched the numbers. But the last step, that's the most important one. They had to control for every other possible explanation. And this right here is the secret sauce. I mean, think about it. Dozens of things can affect a baby's birth weight. So to isolate just the effect of pollution, they had to account for all these other variables, from smoking habits to the parents' education, and even their height and weight. This is the hard, painstaking work that separates real causation from a random coincidence. So after all that effort, what did they find? Not a scary headline, that's for sure. They found a small but significant effect, but, and this is a big but, it was only in a very specific group. Women who spent almost all their time at home. And that's what real science usually looks like. It's careful, it's specific, and it's full of nuance. Okay, so that Spanish study showed us the power of doing careful science on a small scale. But what happens when you apply that same level of rigor to over 100,000 people for 20 years? Well, that's when you get some of the most powerful insights we have into our own health. So let's check out this absolutely massive study. Scientists followed over 120,000 people for 2 decades, and every 4 years they carefully tracked their diet, their exercise, their sleep, all to figure out exactly what tiny changes actually led to long-term weight gain. So first, they figured out the baseline. On average, people in the study gained a little over 3 pounds every 4 years. It's that slow, steady creep that I think a lot of us know all too well, right? It doesn't seem like much, but over 20 years, it really adds up. Then they started to isolate specific foods. So what was the biggest offender? Potato chips. Turns out adding just 1 extra serving of chips a day was associated with gaining an extra pound and a half every 4 years. That was more than any other food they tracked. And on the flip side, what helped? Well, the food most strongly associated with less weight gain was yogurt. Adding 1 serving of yogurt a day was linked to gaining almost a full pound less over that same 4-year period. And that brings us to the big aha moment of the whole study. It wasn't just about calories. The type of food you ate had a huge independent effect. Processed foods like chips and sugary drinks were linked to gaining more weight, while less processed foods like yogurt were linked to gaining less. Okay, so we've seen the difference between a scary headline, a careful small study, and a massive long-term one. So the big question is, how do we actually use all this to protect ourselves from the next wave of confusing health news? Here's a simple 4-step toolkit you can use. First, check the source. Is this a political statement or a peer-reviewed study? Second, listen for those keywords. Are they saying link or association, or are they making a huge claim about a cause? Third, look at the method. How many people were in the study, and did they control for other factors, like we saw in that pollution study? And finally, step 4, seek out the full picture. Don't just react to one headline. Give it a day or two and see what other experts have to say. And that really is the whole point. The goal isn't to become a cynic who dismisses everything. It's to become a curious skeptic. So the next time one of those headlines flashes on your screen, just pause, take a breath, and ask a question. Because that curiosity, that's your absolute best defense against the next big health scare.